What if I told you some of the most powerful leaders in history didn't survive because they were unstoppable? They survived because millions of people chose to stay silent, not because they agreed, not because they were powerless, but because speaking up had a cost too dangerous to pay in different moments of history, from Europe to the Soviet Union, and even in modern societies. Silence was not just a reaction. It became a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a survival strategy. But here's the question nobody wants to ask. When does silence protect people? And when does it protect power? Because history is full of leaders who didn't just rise through strength. They rose through something far more dangerous, the silence of everyone around them. And once you understand that, you will never look at history the same way again. Let's go back to one of the most studied and most disturbing examples in modern history. Germany, 1930s. A leader rises to power, not in silence, but in applause. But what came after was something far more important than applause. It was silence. At first, people thought things were temporary. New laws were introduced. Opposition voices started disappearing. News began to sound different. But the most important change wasn't what was happening publicly. It was what stopped happening privately. People stopped questioning. Neighbors stopped speaking. Friends stopped asking, because speaking up had consequences. Under the Nazi regime, the Gestapo built a system where anyone could be reported, even a small comment. Even a joke could become dangerous. So people made a choice, not to resist, not to agree, but to stay silent. And that silence created something powerful. It didn't just protect the system, it strengthened it, because when nobody speaks against power, power starts to feel invisible. And when power feels invisible, it becomes unstoppable. But here's the deeper truth. It wasn't only fear, it was adaptation. People learned a new rule of survival. Don't say anything that can be used against you. And that mindset spreads faster than laws. So even those who disagreed began to look away. Even those who knew the truth stayed quiet, because silence felt safer than truth. And that is where history takes a dangerous turn. Not when people support a system, but when they stop resisting it. Because once silence becomes normal, truth becomes optional. Now imagine a society where silence isn't just a choice. It becomes a habit you can't afford to break. A place where you don't just fear the government. You fear your neighbor, your coworker, even your own family. This was the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, a system where power didn't only come from laws. It came from uncertainty, because nobody ever truly knew who was listening. People called it a culture of informers. Anyone could report anyone, a disagreement, a political joke, even a misunderstood sentence. And the result wasn't a warning. It was disappearance. So what did people do? They adapted again, but this time silence became deeper, more careful, more constant. People stopped speaking freely. They stopped trusting conversations. Even emotions became controlled, because the danger wasn't just speaking against power. The danger was being misunderstood. So imagine sitting at a dinner table, smiling, nodding, agreeing, while your real thoughts stay locked inside. Not because you are weak, but because survival depends on it. And over time, silence stops feeling like fear. It starts feeling like normal life. And that is where control becomes almost invisible. Because when people stop expressing truth, truth starts disappearing from public life. Even history begins to change, not through rewriting books, but through what people are too afraid to say out loud. So in Stalin's Soviet Union, power didn't always need violence, because silence was doing most of the work. Now you might think this belongs to the past, but silence didn't disappear. It just changed its shape. Today, silence doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from public opinion, social backlash, or fear of reputation loss. A single statement online can spread in seconds, and depending on reaction, it can become something that follows a person for years. So people start filtering themselves, not because someone is watching, but because everyone might be watching. And slowly, a new silence forms. Self-silence. People begin to think twice before speaking, not because they don't have opinions, but because they don't want the cost of those opinions. And over time, silence becomes normal. And once silence becomes normal, it no longer needs enforcement. People enforce it themselves. So why do people stay silent even when they know the truth? First is fear of consequences. Second is learned helplessness. When people believe nothing will change, they stop trying. Third is social pressure. Humans want acceptance, so they silently ask, what will happen if I speak? And most of the time, silence wins. There is also the illusion of normality. When everyone is silent, silence starts to feel correct, even if it isn't. And over time, silence becomes internal. And when silence becomes internal, no system needs to enforce it anymore. So after everything, how do leaders stay powerful? Is it strength, control, strategy, or something quieter? Silence, because when people don't speak, power doesn't need to defend itself. When people don't question, power doesn't need to explain itself. And when people don't resist, power doesn't need to move. But silence is not always the enemy. Sometimes it protects people. Sometimes it prevents chaos. But danger begins when silence becomes permanent, when it stops being a reaction and becomes a culture. Because at that point, truth disappears slowly, without noise, without attention, without resistance. So maybe the real question is not just about leaders. It is about us. When something feels wrong, do we speak or stay silent because it feels easier? Because history doesn't only remember those who spoke loudly, it also remembers those who stayed silent. And sometimes those silent moments changed everything.